I think in the next 12 months, something over 100,000, maybe 150,000. And, in the next 5 years, again, there's a finite supply. And now we have a potentially huge increase in demand with a spot Bitcoin approval. So I think in 5 years, something around 500,000 would be potentially achievable.
암호화폐 전문 매체 데일리오들에 따르면 펀드스트렛의 매니징 파트너인 톰 리는 최근 Cnbc 인터뷰에서 비트코인이 세계 최대 경제 대국인 미국의 현물 비트코인 ETF 도입에 따른 새로운 시장으로부터 엄청난 혜택을 받을 수 있다고 말했습니다. 앞서 이 영상에서 톰 리는 비트코인이 올해 말까지 10만 달러를 넘어 15만 달러까지 치솟을 수 있다고 예측했습니다. 또 그는 향후 5년 안에 공급이 한정되어 있고 비트코인 현물 ETF 승인으로 수요가 크게 증가할 가능성이 있어 5년 안에 50만 달러 정도는 달성할 수 있을 것으로 내다봤습니다. 그는 미국 가계 자산의 극히 일부만 비트코인에 투자해도 비트코인 가치가 2배 이상 상승할 것이라고 봤습니다. 톰 리에 따르면 미국에만 150조 달러의 가계 순자산이 있는데 이 중 1%만 암호화폐에 투자해도 암호화폐 시장 규모는 1조 5천억 달러 늘어나게 되고 이는 비트코인 시총을 훨씬 웃도는 규모입니다. 그럼 펀드스트렛의 매니징 파트너인 톰 리가 비트코인 분석에 대해 말한 것을 들어보겠습니다.
You also came on and made a great call about some upcoming inflation numbers and what it would do to the S&P. What do you see your expertise as now in terms of stock market predictions? Will you do a week? Will you do a day? Do you do these options that expire in like 8 hours? Do you do those, or can we stick with 6 months and 1 year? What would you rather do today?
I'd rather stick with 6 months to 1 year, Joe.
Okay.
Well, I think 2024 is going to ultimately be a good year for stocks because we've got a Fed that's no longer fighting an inflation war, and we know that the ISM manufacturing, these PMIs are bottoming, and that's correlated with earnings beginning to accelerate. And we know there's pent-up CapEx. Capital spending's been sort of held back for the past few years, so that accelerates. That's good for earnings. And we expect mortgage rates to fall, which would be good for consumers. So it's really going to be a good year for stocks. But the caveat being, the first 6 months probably a little more challenging because in the first 6 months, investors are going to be a little itchy or anxious for the Fed to do their first cut. And that uncertainty is going to weigh on stocks. And at the same time, it's going to bring back those who are fearful inflation rears up. So I think it's a good year overall, but most of the gains come in the second half.
Really, this is a simple case of consolidating some of the outsized gains we saw at the end of last year.
Yes, and as we all know, whenever you have a parabolic move, and the move from October to December was basically parabolic, you need to consolidate. In fact, you might even have to decline a bit. So I wouldn't be surprised if we have the market down, as much as 5% by March. But that's really going to end up being a pullback you want to buy because, we're not having a hard landing. The only risk to our view would be if we have a recession.
So that would be the risk. What you think is 20%, 30? What is the risk of recession in your view?
I think it's low. In a typical year, the odds of a recession is 20%. I think it's probably around 20%, maybe even less, because I think what investors have priced in is greater than a 20% recession. As you know, there's still many people skeptical, thinking the only way that a Fed cycle ends is with a recession. So many think you're going to have a recession this year because of the yield curve. I think those have been very costly for investors because people have been overly cautious. But yeah, so I think the recession odds are low.
So you don't think the last mile is going to be an issue because of wage gains or whatever? You think the Fed will get to 2%? People said we're never getting to 2% again. You don't think it's a new normal? You think we go back to where we were for such a long period of time? There's nothing structural that's now in there. It was all supply chain disruptions.
Probably the best clue to this is the fact that we just got consumer inflation expectations from the New York Fed survey earlier this week, and inflation expectations are back to pre-pandemic. So if consumers aren't expecting inflation to reaccelerate, And housing and cars, which has essentially been 86% of the change in inflation, if those are normalizing, and housing doesn't have to be negative, it just has to grow at 3%. And as you know, used cars could fall, like as much as 30% in the next 12 months. You don't really have much behind inflation. So I'd be surprised.
So it was transitory. That's
Yeah.
that's what you're saying. It was transitory all along. It was,
Yes.
it wasn't, it was, it is, it wasn't. So now we decided we're back to that. Okay, so just to end on, give me your 1 year and 5 year price target for Bitcoin.
I think in the next 12 months, something over 100,000, maybe 150,000. And, in the next 5 years, again, there's a finite supply, and now we have a potentially huge increase in demand with a spot Bitcoin approval. So I think in 5 years, something around 500,000 would be potentially achievable.
이런 급변하는 비트코인 시장에서는 다양한 정보도 중요하지만 가장 중요한 것은 투자의 전략과 노하우인데요. 하지만 투자를 하는데 필요한 전략과 노하우는 아무도 알려주지 않습니다. 그래서 구독자분들을 위해 저희가 책을 준비했는데요. 실제로 이 책은 현재 인터넷에서 판매되고 있는 책이며 무려 3만 원대에 판매가 되고 있습니다. 제가 여러분께 이 책을 무료로 나눠드리는 이유는 이 책을 통해서 많은 구독자분이 조금이나마 투자에 도움이 되셨으면 하는 마음에 준비했고 제 사비로 구독자 한 분 한 분께 나눠드리면서 채널을 키우기 위해 투자를 하는 것입니다. 010-5886-4840으로 구독이라고 문자를 보내주시면 한 분 한 분 빠짐없이 모든 분께 책을 무료로 제공해드리겠습니다. 현직 비트코인 투자 전문가의 전략과 노하우를 무료로 배워볼 수 있는 좋은 기회이니 이 혜택을 모든 분이 누리시고 저희 채널을 많이 사랑해 주셨으면 좋겠습니다. 010-5886-4840으로 구독이라고 문자를 보내주시고 책 한 권씩 무료로 받아가셔서 구독자분들이 투자하시는데 큰 도움이 되셨으면 좋겠습니다. 지금까지 시청해 주셔서 감사합니다. 구독과 좋아요, 알람 설정 부탁드립니다. 저는 계속해서 유익한 해외 코인 뉴스를 빠르게 전달하도록 하겠습니다. 감사합니다.